Number 1. Angelo FATICONI, the human cork. Angelo FATICONI had been aware of his special gifts since early childhood. It wasn't until he was an adult, however, that he began capitalizing on what Mother Nature had bestowed him, the phenomenal ability to remain buoyant for long periods of time, even with enormous loads of iron and steel anchored to his body. FATICONI was unsinkable, and he made a living demonstrating that fact. FATICONI, or the human cork as the press and adoring fans called him, could sleep on his side while floating in water. He could stay afloat for hours with lead weighing 20 pounds fastened to his ankles and assume any position in water without danger. He was sewn into a sack with heavy cannonball chained to his body and tossed into the water. He didn't sink but floated up to 8 hours in apparent unconcern, now and then peeping his head out of the top of the sack. He is also reported to have crossed the Hudson River fastened to a lead-weighted chair. Once during a visit to Harvard University, he allowed medical authorities to examine him thoroughly before plunging into pool weighted down with pounds of lead. While he floated for bone-chilling hours, the doctors observing him failed to find support for earlier theories suggesting that he was able to float at such great length due to abnormal internal organs. After testing FATICONI, Harvard University doctors concluded that he did not possess abnormal internal organs and failed to find an explanation for his amazing buoyancy. FATICONI continued astonishing audience with his performance in lakes, rivers and pools. He was investigated numerous times, but no evidence of trickery was ever found. In 1931, while visiting relatives in Jacksonville, Florida, FATICONI died. Although he promised to reveal the secret of his talent, he never did. FATICONI's secret remained an unsolved mystery, one that he took with him to his grave. Number 2. Oakland County Child Killer. Between 1976 and 1977, an unidentified killer stalked the roads of sleepy Oakland County, Michigan, abducting and killing at least 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. Mark Stebbins, 12 years old, Jill Robinson, 12 years old, Christine Mihlich, 10 years old, and Timothy King, 11 years old. Mark was strangled and sexually assaulted with an object. Jill was killed with a shotgun blast to the face. Christine was smothered, and Timothy suffocated and assaulted in the same fashion as Mark. Each child had been held for captive for several days before being murdered, and laid out neatly where they were meant to be found. Jill Robinson was found within the view of the police station. The killings resulted in a mass paranoia in the area. Children were rarely left alone for a second, and at least one innocent man was beaten for the mistake of talking to a child. A massive investigation heralded several suspects, but no solid case was ever built. Recently, some have come to believe noted serial killer John Wayne Gacy has been implicated in the murders, but it seems unlikely, as it did not match his modus operandi of raping and killing older teenage boys. In 1978, the killing stopped cold. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the case was a letter written by Timothy King's mother in the Detroit News. Marion King begged her son's captor to let him go so that he might return to home and enjoy his favorite meal, Kentucky Fried Chicken. When the boy's body was found, his skateboard, which he had been using when he went missing, was placed beside him. His clothes were neatly pressed and washed, and the worst part, an autopsy showed that the killer had fed him fried chicken shortly before he was murdered. Number 3. Phantom Girl. When employees of the Krasnoyarsk Regional Museum in Siberia set about the task of digitizing a series of photographs that dated back to the early 1900s, they realized the photos contained something startling. The same little girl was found in around 20 images and in 4 glass negatives, all of which had been taken sometime between 1906 and 1908. The best guess is that the mystery girl with the long plait is aged between 8 and 10. Some of the photographs were used for postcards of the city. Yet over many decades, no one commented on the hardly visible well-dressed girl, so much so that for more than a century, her presence has gone unnoticed. It is only when a random group of pictures, garnered from different sources, is collected together, then her constant presence is suddenly so striking. For example, on one she stands on a rooftop in an image of the famous Krasnoyarsk railway bridge, which carries the Trans-Siberian Railway over the Yenisei River. When the picture was shot, the bridge, opened in 1899, must have been less than a decade old. She is not the focal point of the picture, yet when you know she is there, she certainly catches the eye. In another, she poses with several boys near Krishnaya's teacher's seminary. One more has her fixing her eyes at the camera, gently holding her umbrella in her hands, a dark ribbon at the end of her long plait, next to a slightly younger girl, not so well dressed. In these three images, she is clearly present. In others, she is there but is scarcely visible to the naked eye. In photographs of some buildings, she is hardly more than a speck, but she is there. It was only modern equipment that allowed the researchers to notice the girl. When you look at the old pictures, you do not see her at all. Most of the images are anonymous, but some have the FEA imprint on them. So far, it has not been possible to identify a photographer using these initials. The only possible theory is that she might have been related to the photographer, but no one has yet come forward to identify the mysterious young girl. And also, if she is related to the photographer and he or she just wanted to take the pictures of the girl, then why is she out of the focus in most of the pictures? What was the aim? The museum, in hopes of locating her, have released a series of postcards pointing out the girl so that locals may help identify her. Number 4. Bizarre Ritual. On Sunday, February 8, 1981, the headless body of an African-American man was found wrapped in a sleeping bag by Alwood Lake, not far from where Hyde Street ends at Stanyan. Police couldn't locate the victim's head, but they did discover a chicken wing and 2 kernels of corn jammed into the bloody neck stump. A slaughtered chicken was also found 50 yards from the corpse. Police speculated that either a very sharp axe or a machete was used. A deputy coroner called the cut very clean. Fingerprints identified the headless man as Leroy Carter Jr., a 29-year-old petty criminal with a bit of a rap sheet, but nothing that should have had him becoming some kind of a human sacrifice. Because of the ritualistic nature of the killing, the case was given to Inspector Sandy Gallant. She had recently handled the local investigation in the wake of Jonestown massacre in Guyana. Without knowing it, she had become the department's resident expert on religious extremists. With the dead chicken in mind, Gallant reached out Charles Whitley, the coroner of Dade County, Florida, and one of the country's top experts on Santeria, a religion brought to the Caribbean by West African slaves. Whitley told Gallant that the murderer would return the severed head to the scene of the crime in 42 days to complete the ghastly ritual. Gallant was laughed at by the homicide investigators and chief of detectives after she told them about the ritual. And as the 42-day mark neared, even Gallant was filled with self-doubt. But sure enough, Carter's head turned up under a bush near Alwood Lake exactly 42 days later on March 22, 1981. And since none of the investigators believed in the ritual, there was no one out there doing surveillance. The murder of Leroy Carter Jr. remains unsolved. Number 5. Bo Weevil Jackson. It's amazing to think a musician could appear out of nowhere, record 2 albums and then just vanish. But such a thing occurred in 1926. That year, Paramount Records released a blues album featuring songs by an African-American blues singer-guitarist named Bo Weevil Jackson. Shortly thereafter, OAKLAND Records released another blues album with the songs by the same man. Only this time he used the name Sam Butler. This is the last time that anyone ever heard from him. Paramount's publicity material states that Jackson was from the Carolinas, but the legend goes that he was discovered performing for tips on a street in Birmingham, Alabama, and brought to Chicago to record the albums. In total, Jackson recorded 13 tracks, and blues historians have praised his musical abilities. Unfortunately, no other documentation of him seems to exist, so his true identity remains unknown. Number 6. Phantom Barber. In the early days of World War II, warship construction helped the tiny fishing town of Pascagoula, Mississippi, grow from a population of 5,000 to nearly 15,000, seemingly overnight. Although a large population meant an economic boost for local businesses, it also meant the police force was struggling to keep the large population in line. Aside from expected increase in drunken brawls and burglaries, the citizens of Pascagoula were stalked by more than a specter of war. A hair-cutting phantom terrorized the night. The man named Phantom Barber by newspapers worked in darkness, made more profound by the Army's blackout regulations. On Monday and Friday evenings, he slit a window screen to gain access to a house, crept inside and cut the hair of sleeping occupants, particularly blonde girls. Not necessarily one lock or two, but sometimes sharing as much as a full head of hair. He took nothing else from the home except his prize. He began with 2 girls in the convent of Our Lady of Victories, followed by a 6-year-old female child visiting another family. This time he left a clue, the print of a man's bare foot in sand on an unoccupied bed in the room. The police were baffled and offered a $300 reward for information. The public was in a panic. Women refused to go outside at night. Men applied for pistol permits. Bloodhounds were brought in to track the bizarre intruder, but the efforts failed. The phantom barber continued his hair-cutting incursions. At last, the phantom broke his pattern, or so it seemed. A window screen was lit in the home of Mr. and Mrs. Terrell Heidelberg, and the intruder came inside their bedroom. However, rather than cutting hair, he brutally assaulted the couple. Mrs. Heidelberg lost her front teeth and was knocked unconscious, while her husband was beaten with a metal bar. Both survived the attack. 2 months later, the police chief announced the arrest of a suspect, William A. Dolan, a chemist who was charged with the attempted murder. A connection between Dolan and Phantom Barber came with the discovery of human hair allegedly found near his residence. Dolan was quickly found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was never charged with any crimes related to the hair snatching incidents, but in the eyes of the public, he was the Phantom Barber. 6 years later, Mississippi Governor Fielding Wright reviewed the case and asked that Dolan take a lie detector test. Upon passing, Dolan was given a limited suspended sentence and then eventually set free in 1951. Since the Phantom Barber never touched his victims other than their hair, it would seem no meaningful tie exists between Dolan and the Phantom Barber, whose break-ins ended as mysteriously as they began. Number 7. GOBEKLI TEPE. Every so often, a discovery happens that forces us to reimagine what we think we know about humanity, and how we got to where we are today. Turkey's GOBEKLI TEPE is certainly one such discovery. The site, located at the top of a mountain ridge, is composed of more than 200 pillars up to 20 feet in height and weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in roughly 20 circles. Many of the pillars have predatory animals engraved on them, and none of this would be surprising if it was built in, say, 2000 BC. But GOBEKLI TEPE was built more than 13,000 years ago, predating Stonehenge by more than 8,000 years. Its existence completely upends the conventional view of the rise of civilizations. Prior to the discovery of this site, we believed that the people of that time lacked complex symbolic systems, social hierarchies, and division of labor, 3 prerequisites we thought for building a 22-acre massive temple. Formal religion, meanwhile, is supposed to have appeared only after agriculture produced such hierarchical social relations. The findings at GOBEKLI TEPE, however, suggest that we might have the story backward. Perhaps it was the need to build a sacred site that first fueled hunter-gatherers in their quest to organize themselves as a workforce, to settle down in one place, to secure stable food supply, and to eventually invent agriculture. But the existence of the site raises far more questions than it answers. How did a nomadic Neolithic man manage to organize a workforce to complete this site? Why was it built? How come it predates similar structures by thousands of years? Excavation started on the site in 1996, and most of it still remains to be unearthed. But for now, these questions must go unanswered. Number 8. Burke and Hare murder dolls. In the late 1820s, 2 men in Edinburgh, Scotland began a grisly cottage industry. William Hare and William Burke were Irishmen who became friends. When a tenant at Hare's house died, the pair sold his body to Edinburgh University. They quickly realized they could make a pretty penny doing this, but unfortunately, bodies were in short supply, so they decided to create some of their own. All told, they killed 16 people, mostly by smothering, and sold their wares to a Dr. Knox at the university. One day, a tenant at Hare's boarding house found a body and went to the police. They managed to dispatch with the corpse before the police arrived, but Burke and Hare's crime spree was over. Hare turned over on his accomplice in exchange for his freedom. Burke's fate would mirror that of his victims. After his execution, he was dissected in public. Hare vanished, never to be seen again. But the story doesn't end there. Shortly after the murder spree, a young boy playing in a cave in Edinburgh came across a collection of carved wooden dolls in a cave. There were 17 in all, about the size of a finger, each secreted in its own tiny coffin. It didn't take long for the people to realize the dolls greatly resembled the victims of Burke and Hare, in both number and appearance. DNA tests on the macabre toys against the remains of Burke yielded no results. Only 8 of the 17 are still known to exist. They can be seen at the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. But just who created these morbid effigies and what they were meant to represent will never be known. Number 9. The Whistler. Back in 1950s, newspapers were full of story of Phantom Whistler of Louisiana. The Whistler was terrorizing a young woman, 18-year-old Jacqueline Cadow. He would hide in the shrubbery outside her house at night and whistle a funeral dirge. The home she shared with her mother was also broken into by an intruder. She reported the incidents to the authorities, but nothing came out of it. Night after night, she heard the same whistle until she announced her engagement to the state trooper Herbert Balsam. The whistler changed his tune to a blood-curdling moan. Around this time, Jacqueline also received telephone threats. The voice on the other end of the call promising to come to her home and stick a knife in her if she went ahead with the marriage. Her sleep continued to be broken by the whistling dirges and blood-curdling moans. Jacqueline suffered a collapse when she, her mother, her aunt, and a New Orleans State's item reporter heard the whistler at work. The reporter and Balsam searched the yard, but found no one. Investigations by the state police and the sheriff's office turned up nothing. The harassed bride-to-be tried staying with relatives. The whistler soon followed, and when she went to the home of Balsam's parents, the whistler called her mother with a message. "Tell Jackie I know she is at Herbert's house." On October 1, she and Balsam got married. Was the whistler at the wedding as he promised? If so, he never spoke up, nor did he carry out his threats. The local sheriff considered the case closed. Who was the Phantom Whistler? And why did he choose to terrify Jacqueline Cadow? We'll probably never know. Number 10. An Unfinished Race. On September 3, 1873, a man named James Worson had accepted a challenge to race in record time, from the town of Leamington to the town of Coventry, a 20-mile trek. He had been boosting off his foot skills and then was asked to prove them. So with sporting good spirits, he set about to do just that. Two friends, Hammerson Burns and Barham Weiss, followed behind in a horse-drawn gig. Burns brought along his camera. Worson was never out of their sight and would often turn around while running to exchange some friendly words with the two riders. Running in the middle of the road, Worson suddenly appeared to stumble and pitch forward, having time enough for only one short piercing scream. Weiss later said it was the most ghastly sound either of us had ever heard. But as Worson pitched forward with that terrible cry, instead of falling to the ground as he appeared to be about to have done, he completely and totally vanished in mid-fall, before ever striking the ground. The road itself told the story and Weiss took the pictures to prove it. There, in the soft dirt, were Worson's footprints. They led down to the middle of the road, looked as if the runner stumbled, and there they disappeared. A search was called and the locals scoured the area for James. The bloodhounds used in the search were strangely reluctant to approach the spot where Worson disappeared. He was never seen or heard from again. So what can we make of this fantastic story? Well, unfortunately, as incredible as it would be, the bizarre tale of James Worson, the man who disappeared, is pure fiction. You see, while searching about this case, I found that the story of James Worson is just that, a story. It comes from an American journalist and author, Ambrose Bierce. He had written a story titled An Unfinished Race, which gave rise to the popular urban legend. However, there is one real unexplained mystery that surrounds this story, with an eerie coincidence. It involves a real-life disappearance. The disappearance of author Ambrose Bierce himself. You see, around 1913, Ambrose Bierce had traveled to Mexico on an assignment in regards to the ongoing Mexican Revolution. He was 71 at the time, and the last anyone heard of him was in a letter he allegedly sent to Blanche Partington that contained the ominous words, "I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." Unknown indeed. One account of vanishing man that's fiction, one that's truth. A strange twist where life mimics fantasy.